minutes late. For any of you who don't know me, my name's Mark Littlewood. I'm the Director General here at the IEA. And we return again to the controversial topic of Europe and the Eurozone. We've run quite a series of events on Europe and the Eurozone over recent months. Now, many more planned over the following weeks, over the coming weeks and months. Being a pro-market think tank, we kind of respond to demand, and there's always a lot of demand to discuss these issues. And we're particularly gathered today to discuss some of the ideas put forward in this excellent new monograph, The Euro, the Beginning, the Middle and the End, which has been edited by our editorial director, Philip Booth, and is available today in the next door room for the knockdown price of just £5. I think we will accept any other currency. We reckon that was €6, $7.50. I'm not sure what it equates to in gold, if you happen to have any in your pocket. We'll take anything as long as it's sort of cash or valuable minerals. So please do pick up a copy of that if you haven't already received one. We've got a very distinguished panel tonight to put forward, I think, a range of eclectic views about the position that the Euro finds itself in. All contributors to this monograph, which doesn't sketch out one potential solution to where the Euro finds itself, but a range of different and indeed contradictory solutions. You will find it impossible to agree with all five of our panellists this evening, or indeed with all of the arguments put in this book. I'm going to ask each of our panellists to speak for about 7 minutes or so. I do have a bell with me which I will ring after 6 minutes, then ring again after 7 and ring continuously after 8 to try and make sure our panellists keep to time. And so let me introduce to you our panel this evening and the order in which they'll speak from nearest to me to my far left. Our first speaker is Juan Castañeda, being Doctor of Economics and lecturer in economics at the University of Buckingham, visiting researcher at Cass Business School. And has great experience in researching monetary policy and central banking. He is the editor of the blog The Old Lady of Threadneedle Street.wordpress.com, and he co-wrote the chapter in this monograph on Saving Monetary Union, a Market Solution for the Orderly Suspension of Greece. Next speaker will be Jamie Dannhauser, senior economist at Lombard Research, but he joined in 2006. He's written articles for the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, Financial World and many others. He's a member of the IEA's Shadow Monetary Policy Committee. And he wrote the chapter in here, The Euro, the Story of a Suboptimal Currency Area, arguing that monetary union was essentially a political, not an economic project, that the Eurozone's undoing has not been down to asymmetric shocks, but asymmetry of reactions to common global shocks and a common monetary policy. And that these imbalances need redressing. Our third speaker is Kevin Dowd, Professor of Finance and Economics at Durham Business School. He's written extensively on free banking, central banking and bank regulation, monetary economics, financial risk management and pensions, has many publications to his name. He wrote the chapter in this monograph, possibly the most radical chapter, Back to the Future, a free banking solution for the Eurozone. He argues that the Eurozone crisis is in terminal decline, that the European Federalist project was built on unsound foundations, and the two main problems have been fiscal moral hazard and the democratic deficit, and that the opportunity now exists to build a new monetary system based on ideas that have historically worked in practice. Our fourth speaker is Bodo Herzog, Professor of Economics and Director of the Institute of Finance and Economics at ESB Business School. His research has focused on macroeconomics and monetary policy. He co-wrote the chapter in this monograph, Where Should the Eurozone Club Go From Here? How a return to credible and enforceable rules will sustain the monetary union. He argues that EMU won't fail if policymakers return to credible, strict, consistent and enforceable rules, and proposes mechanisms to create a well-founded European monetary union in the long run. And last but no means least is the IEA's very own Professor Patrick Minford, Professor of Applied Economics at Cardiff Business School at Cardiff University, and has previously been Professor of Applied Economics at Liverpool University. He was a member of the Monopolies Commission during the early to mid-90s, and one of Her Majesty's Treasury's panel of forecasters, the so-called wise men, from 93 to 96. He wrote the chapter in this book, Britain and the Eurozone, a triumph of economics over politics, and argues that the UK chose not to join the Euro on economic grounds, that the Euro crisis has made cost of membership higher and has triggered institutional evolution, and that there needs to be a reassessment of the UK's relationship with the European Union. Please join with me in welcoming your panel this evening. Juan, let's start with you.
All right, thank you very much. Well, first of all, thank you very much for your very kind presentation. It is a pleasure for me to be here. I don't know, is the microphone on? Yeah. Right. Because the reason why I'm asking this is because I don't know if you can notice that, but I don't have, this is not my standard, my normal voice at all. I've been suffering a cold in the last 3 days, and finally I have some voice, so I will try to use it wisely today. I will try to exploit it wisely, as I say. First of all, I wanted to say that the proposal we did here, with which we contributed to this volume, is not only mine, but it is also that of Professors Cabrillo and Swartz, both from the University of Madrid. And why did we propose a parallel currencies a solution for the Eurozone crisis? Well, there were, and still there are to some extent, two major problems affecting the Eurozone. In relation to Greece, if we want to apply this proposal to Greece, it was very evident at the time, 3 or 4 years ago, that Greece was unable to pay back its obligations. And it is now very obvious that it is insolvent. It is also very evident that Greece cannot achieve the so-called internal devaluation needed to restructure its economy and resume economic growth at some point. The reduction of its costs that it will require, costs, wages, prices, would be enormous. Which has been the reaction of the European authorities to these two major problems, affecting not only Greece, but many other countries, especially the Mediterranean countries? Europe has opted for a sort of a no-member state left-behind policy, so a non-exit strategy, regardless the costs of this policy and, to some extent, its effects on the credibility of the Euro project itself. Well, I do think, we do think that austerity measures are necessary, but not enough to realign the Greek economy and many other economies suffering a big crisis now in Europe. This policy, the conduction of austerity measures, is very costly politically and socially, and to some extent it may be useless in order, as I said before, to achieve that degree of internal devaluation needed to resume economic growth in these countries. And also, it is now very evident that we have suffered a sort of an institutional problem in Europe. Why? Because there were not the institutions needed to deal with the first, even though a major Eurozone crisis, which have been conducted via very costly and never-ending negotiations, which have, all of them, increased the degree of uncertainty about the future and the success of the common currency. And finally, we make a point by saying that the succession of several bailouts is a very expensive solution for the rest of the Eurozone members and also for the assisted countries. And not only this, it is not a definitive solution to the problem, which is even worse. So what we propose in this chapter, in this volume, is for Greece to be temporarily suspended from the Eurozone, and this should be accompanied by the circulation of two currencies floating freely in the market in Greece, with no legal tender clause applying to any of those. The euro and the new devalued drachma. Both currencies, as I said, would freely float in the market with no fixed exchange rates at all. The degree of the devaluation, the extent of the devaluation could be, well, this is a very controversial estimate, but it could be roughly around 50 or 60% in relation to the current exchange rate with the euro. And most importantly, Greek banks would have access to the financial services provided by the two competing monetary clubs, according to our proposal. One led by the European Central Bank and the other led by the Central Bank of Greece. So banks, commercial banks in Greece, will have access to both clearinghouses, according to our proposal. Well, obviously this is easier said than done. Of course, there are many practical or operational difficulties in relation to our proposal that we must take into account. Given the time that we have, let me just emphasize some of them. I will have to ask you to please read the chapter for more details. In the first place, the liabilities of the Greek state and the Greek residents would have to be redenominated in new and devalued drachmas. As to the holders of Greek bonds in the rest of the world, well, arrangements such as the Club of Paris and the Club of London could be reached on euro-denominated private and public debt. We have seen last year, actually, that there was applied a haircut to the Greek bonds. It was accepted by the creditors. So this is the sort of arrangement that could take place in the future, if needed. And most importantly, in order to avoid a run on banks, we need to guarantee the deposits of the residents in Greece in euros. Why? Because we know that if Greek holders of euro accounts fear the deposits will suddenly be redenominated in devalued drachmas, they will try to convert them into euro notes immediately or send them abroad, which already happened in the past. So we will have a panic in the system, in the monetary system, in the economy, something we must avoid. This is why quite many experts propose that any expulsion of a member state from the Eurozone must be accompanied by two conditions. One, we must take deposit holders by surprise, and two, it must be preceded by the imposition of capital controls. Well, the way we propose here, the way we opt for in our proposal, is that we don't need to impose exchange of capital controls, but just to guarantee deposits in euros. So, as I said, exchange or capital controls wouldn't be necessary to avoid a run on Greek banks, as deposits in euros would be guaranteed by the rest of the Eurozone member states. Which is the cost of this proposal? Well, we may want to calculate it very roughly. Assuming a 50% of the valuation of the new drachma, the cost of a fully guaranteed deposit guarantee in Greece would be around 110 billion euros, which is less than half of the amount of the bailout programs already approved and committed. And most importantly, this would be a guarantee, not necessarily an upfront payment. With regard to the non-financial private sector, the bank deposits wouldn't be redenominated in drachmas, but mortgages, thank you, and other loans from banks to the private sector will have to be redenominated to maintain the solvency of the households and firms, as wages would be paid also in drachmas. Let me just conclude by saying that one of the most important consequences of adopting this proposal would be that, in our view, the parallel circulation of euros and drachmas would encourage the Bank of Greece not to overissue and the Greek treasury not to overspend under the pain of shrinking seigniorage in both cases. And this could be a practical way to adjust prices and wages, again, quickly and less painfully. And it doesn't have to be inflationary if it is accompanied by orthodox fiscal and monetary policies. I'm sorry that I took more time than I was given.
No, just about bang on time.
All right, so thank you very much and thank you for your patience.
Thank you. Jamie.
Thank you very much, Mark, and Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not going to say very much at all about the mechanisms for fixing the mess we're in. My esteemed colleagues have got a lot more to say on that than I do. But what I'm going to try and focus on in my 5 or 6 minutes is the economics behind this. There are plenty of very, very important political and social arguments that stand behind a lot of the discussions we're going to have tonight. But I want to focus on the economic question. Was the euro a mistake on pure economic grounds, and does it have a future on economic grounds, putting to one side the clear political and social difficulties of fixing the mess? I'm going to start with a quote, which is probably my favourite one on the euro and the one I started my chapter on, which was from Ottmar Issing in 1991, where he said, "There is no example in history of a lasting monetary union that was not linked to one state." Now clearly that's got political undertones, but in my view that sums up a huge part of the economic story, namely that I think where a lot of people have got to in terms of the discussion now is that without full banking union, probably full fiscal union, and probably full political union, the Eurozone does not have a future with all 17 members. And I'm going to try and explain, at least economically, why I feel that to be the case. Now the chapter I wrote was very much theoretical, thinking through some of what we call the optimal currency area literature. And what that was really about was asking questions about what circumstances have to be met, what conditions have to be met for certain countries to join together in a monetary union, for them to give up their monetary independence. Now there's plenty of detail in the book and I won't go through it now, but we can think of plenty of them: price and wage flexibility, mobility of labour and capital, the diversification of production between different countries, how converged are economic cycles, are countries being hit by the same kind of economic shocks, are they responding in the same way to those economic shocks? Clearly built into that is the extent to which financial markets are integrated and the banking sector is integrated. And finally there's the issue of political will, which surprisingly a lot of economists felt at the time was a rather important part of the story, and clearly as we're seeing at the moment, political will is an essential part of the story. Now I think the sort of early view about the euro was we're not really sure whether it fits these criteria at the outset. But I think the economic view, particularly in continental Europe as the euro has evolved, is that even if a lot of these countries didn't meet these criteria at the outset, the mere fact that they all joined together in monetary union would mean they would achieve the convergence that was ultimately necessary to meet these optimal criteria for a monetary union. So even if it wasn't an OCA ex ante, ex post, it was always going to turn out to be. And I think certainly my reading of the evidence, particularly for European economists, is that was the consensus on the eve of the crisis. I'm not convinced that's necessarily the view shared by Anglo-Saxon economists, particularly in the UK and the US. But I think there was a reasonably strong consensus in Europe that monetary union in Europe was on its way to becoming an optimal currency area. Now, I would argue that there are plenty of economic arguments that people on this panel were making many years ago about why that was not the case. But I think what's clear is events subsequently have proved the Eurozone was not an optimal currency area in any shape or form. And I think the conclusion that I've come to is that without some kind of radical redesign in the underlying institutional architecture of the monetary union in Europe, all 17 members of the currency union will not be there in a few years' time. And maybe in the Q&A we can get into a discussion about exactly what form that takes, who it might leave, etc. But just to talk a little about what went wrong, a lot of what I talk about in the book is the economic imbalances that built up, and I think there are 4 key things that economists have focused on. One is the build-up of an absolutely staggering amount of private sector debt. If one looks at banking crises in the US around the Depression, you go back to the S&L crisis in the 90s in the US, Korean crisis, Asian crisis in the mid-90s, if you go back to Japan in the early 90s, the level of private sector debt that was built up in many parts of Europe, including core countries as well as periphery, was substantially higher than anything we've seen in past severe banking crises in the past. Now that was accompanied by very large external imbalances, current account positions, international investment positions, big gaps in competitiveness between countries, very poor productivity gains in southern Europe for most of the decade running up to the crisis. Now I haven't yet mentioned government debt and public debt, and there are clearly countries, Greece, Italy to an extent, where issues of public debt are central, but I think one of the things that's been very frustrating for me in the debate about the Eurozone is how much focus, at least politically, has been placed on the fiscal story, and nothing like enough has been placed on the issues of public debt, banks, and competitiveness. Now, there's an argument that I remember hearing quite a lot before the crisis that somehow all these imbalances were optimal. The ECB was quite fond of saying this, that somehow it was economically optimal to have Greece running a 15% of GDP current account deficit and the Germans running a surplus of 10% of their GDP. The argument went, well, these are relatively poor countries, they're borrowing from abroad to finance productive investment, so these imbalances are good, they're ultimately leading to higher long-term productive potential in Southern Europe, which will produce higher incomes and they can therefore pay back borrowing in the future. And that was the argument that was given quite a lot from the ECB. Now, that may well have happened to an extent, but I think what we've clearly seen over the last few years is that a lot of the borrowing and a lot of the investment was not placed into productive assets. We clearly know about the real estate bubbles in Spain, Ireland, etc. So I'm not entirely convinced at all that these imbalances were somehow an optimal response to catch-up potential in Southern Europe at all. So the question is, can it ultimately be fixed? Now, I've said that I don't believe there were ex-ante mechanisms for preventing a lot of these imbalances. But then we move on to the next question, which is, are there ways that we can deal with them now they have arisen? Now, that ultimately turns on several issues about countries leaving, can we find a mechanism for keeping them in? But I think my judgment certainly is that the euro that we found in 2007 certainly did not have the ex-post adjustment mechanisms for dealing with the mess. And I think it's highly questionable whether, where we are today, those mechanisms are yet in place. And maybe we can get on to a discussion about whether politically they are feasible going forward. What does history tell us? Well, I've spent a lot of the last 2 or 3 years looking at Japan in the early 1990s. And I think one of the really interesting parts about the Japanese crisis is just how much worse things in Southern Europe look today. Japan, after all, was an economy that had relatively low levels of public debt, a big fiscal surplus going into its crisis, monetary independence, its own currency, levels of private sector debt were substantially lower in Japan in 89-90 than they are in many Eurozone countries today. So I think if we want to look to Japan as a point of history that we can learn from, I think I would argue the position in Southern Europe is substantially worse. Now, I think there's plenty to say, but I just want to sort of finish up by answering the 2 questions as the title of the talk. Was the euro a mistake? Well, I think clearly for some, you can argue even several Eurozone countries, it was. Just before coming here today, I just dug into the IMF's database, and I just dug out all the numbers for 17 Eurozone countries, looking at GDP per head on PPP basis and compared it to the US, going out to 2018 when the IMF forecasts end and tracking it over the 20 years from 1998. The only countries over that 20-year period who will have increased their living standards relative to the US are Ireland, Estonia, Slovenia and Slovakia. So the other 13 nations will all have seen a loss of living standards relative to the technological frontier, the US economy, over the 20 years going up to 2018. So I think there's a strong economic case for saying that for many countries, the euro was a mistake and is still a very large mistake. Can it be fixed? Well, I think my view, given a lot of the work I've been doing on the debt overhang in Europe, is that without very substantial write-downs of debt, sovereign, but more importantly, banking assets and private sector debt, it is not going to be fixed. I don't think there is any other option other than substantial debt write-downs. There's a big question mark about how that can be done in the political environment today. Maybe we can get on to that discussion. But I think where I will just end up is just going back to the comment that Issing made 20 years ago. Without one state, no monetary union has lasted over the long term. And I do question, going forward, whether it's really feasible for all 17 members to stay in the club unless we have full political and fiscal union. Thank you.
Jamie, thank you very much indeed. Kevin.
Thank you.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd just like to start, and I've got 8 minutes, isn't it, Mark? With a question for you. What's the price of the book in Cypriot euros?
That's a very good question.
About 100?
That will be up for the negotiation with whichever intern is selling them.
Free exchange.
It's a sort of barter economy out there.
Well, monetary economists believe in that. Anyway, what I want to talk about tonight is a kind of good news, bad news situation. And I think the good news is I think the Eurozone crisis is terminal. I think the Eurozone itself is doomed, at least as we know it, and the EU too. And I'm tempted, thank you, I'm tempted to gloat on this, but it would be most inappropriate because I think the outcome could be absolutely horrendous. But let me first off state my reasons, and they're quite simple. I think the EU federalist project was always built on unsound foundations. It was as simple as that. And many of us said this at the time and were totally ignored. We have inadequate controls, inadequate governance. We have virtually no accountability whatsoever. We have a huge democratic deficit. And underlying this, what our Marxist friends would describe as a huge legitimation crisis. And this is now, if you like, the chickens coming home to roost. So in effect, what we're seeing is long denied realities simply reasserting themselves. Now the bad news is that I think we can make out the end game, and I think the end game will be very unpleasant. Number one, I think we're seeing attempts to avert fiscal disaster, which are simply creating pressures for fiscal centralisation. That's the first point. And number two, these pressures, and let's be blunt about it, will make much of Euroland into a German sphere of influence, to use the old-fashioned language. Number three, the inevitable nationalist reaction to this will tear the EU apart. So that's my basic thesis. Now you might say in times like this, what else can you do except panic or tinker, etc., etc. But I would assert it's exactly in situations like this when one should really go back to first principles and see if we can get a sense of where we would like to be. So I would suggest that we look at what an ideal system would look like. And to me, an ideal system would have a whole slew of desirable features, such as strong governance, accountability, that's to say accountability that works, sound money, sound banking, financial stability, etc., etc. And what strikes me most when I look at this list of desirable features is that every single one of them is totally absent in the system that we now face in Europe. So if we look at the opposite, the system we've got, we have arbitrary politicised decision-making by people who don't know what they're doing, massive misallocations of resources due to interest rate manipulation, etc. An insolvent financial system, poor governance, insolvent governments, out-of-control risk-taking, no concern for the long run at all, huge cost, and armies, proliferating armies of totally useless regulatory systems. And I could go on, but I don't have all night. So this ideal system is as different from our current system as it is possible to be. And of course, this ideal system is free banking. That is to say, a truly free market in money and finance. Of course, the 64 trillion euro problem is how to get from here to there. And I have a few ideas on that. You're welcome to read them in the chapter. But beyond that, I can only applaud those who are trying to make a difference, especially the politicians. So in this country, one thinks of Steve Baker and Doug Carswell in the UK Parliament and Syed Kamal in the EU Parliament. So, good luck to them. Now, of course, the obvious objection to all of this is that this is kind of utopian, it's unrealistic, basically. That's the standard line we've had to face right from the word go. Now the implication, think about this. If something's unrealistic, then basically that's an invitation to think with the conventional mindset. And to that, I would make a number of short responses. Number one, it's exactly the conventional mindset that got us into this mess in the first place. So clearly, I would assert, conventional thinking won't get us out. Number two, sound money and sound finance have served us well in the past and would do so again if we can re-establish them. And as Lady T used to say, there is no alternative. So thank you very much before Mark gets me.
Thank you.
Thank
Bodo.
you.
First of all, I have to thank you for inviting me. It's a great pleasure for me to be here on this distinguished panel. And I have also to say a special thank to Philip, who has arranged this brilliant book, because I believe there is a need for this debate. So my paper, together with my colleague, addresses two questions. First of all, where should the Eurozone go from here, and how to restore credible economic governance in the Eurozone? Well, it's obvious that despite some improvements, the Euro crisis is not yet over. Behind the improvements lie three reasons. First, there is a strong desire or will, political will, to keep the Eurozone intact, in particular also by Germany and other countries. The second reason is the vulnerable countries, so the countries in South Europe, stick to the reforms. And the third reason is the unprecedented measure by the ECB. All 3 points, they have stabilized monetary union in the short run. But we argue in our chapter that this does not solve the structural problems we have heard here by one of my colleagues. So in my chapter, we address 2 questions. So how can we restore confidence in the long run to stabilize monetary union? And there are 2 possibilities. First, breakup. Free banking, maybe. But I believe, even if I agree with some of the arguments, of course, I believe from a political point of view, what we have seen in the past 3 years, it's not the realistic option we will see. Therefore, what is the other possibility? The other possibility is reform the European Monetary Union. And we are arguing in this direction. But here we have 2 possibilities. One is integration, political union, European finance minister, European taxes. And we believe this is not the right track. We believe going back to the roots is a better option. So we established a rule-based framework, a European Monetary Union which is based on rules, but we have to change, of course, the rules, because we have learned that the rules which were in place right from the beginning are not sufficient, are wrong, enforcement has failed, and so on and so forth. So what we argue in this chapter is that we have to change the rules in 2 different directions. First, we have to imitate market forces with rules. A standalone country like the UK is always forced by markets to implement structural reforms, to stay competitive. And in the monetary union, we have moral hazard incentives, free riding. And what we need, therefore, we need rules that put the pressure on these countries to reform the labor markets, to stay competitive. So we argue that there are criteria, fiscal policy criteria, to establish such a rule-based framework. What is necessary is we need ex-ante conditionalities with a tough monitoring process. We have to implement and improve the enforcement of the rules. For instance, in terms when we talk about the Stability and Growth Pact, we argue that the Stability and Growth Pact has not failed because of the idea. The idea is the balanced budget, which is it's economically a good idea to have. But it has failed, the enforcement has failed of the Stability and Growth Pact. So we have to improve the enforcement. And there are different ways. You can do the enforcement automatic. You can implement an independent expert committee which enforces the rule. Or you can link enforcement by reputation. If a country is in line, stick to the rules, it has full voting power at the European level. If a country violates a fiscal rule, then the voting power on the European level is reduced. So there are several ways how to improve the institutional setup of the monetary union, and we believe that it's possible to establish a monetary union based on a rule-based framework. So in a nutshell, our proposed principle will create a well-founded EMU in the long term. Policymakers have, of course, to learn that fiscal and economic policy in the monetary union is continuously hard work. Of course, rules will restrict the scope of maneuver in the domestic area. However, once again, market forces do the same for standalone countries, and therefore rules is just what market forces are for standalone countries. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to this discussion.
Thank you very much indeed. Patrick.
Thank you, Mark. Good Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and fellow panelists. This is a very interesting book with all sorts of different ideas, as you've got the flavour tonight. And my chapter is really not at all about trying to re-engineer the euro. My chapter is a sort of weary sigh of acceptance that the euro elite will never abandon the euro. And my text really starts with a debate I had before in the 90s with a German politician. Probably have one of your a politician you probably know, but I won't name him. Actually, fortunately, I can't remember his name. But he was very enthusiastic. We had this debate about creating the euro, and I said, look, this is a dreadful idea, you know. And I gave him all the arguments that my colleagues have given. And he said, so you think there will be economic problems? I said, yes. He said, good, good. Then we will have energy to create a political Europe. And that has been the intention all along. Now, the crisis that is now occurring is probably far worse than anybody imagined might be the sort of fiery, volcanic material in which this political union was going to be forged. It's some volcano we're facing in Europe, that's clear. But the general effect has been very much what this politician thought would happen. What do we hear? Bodo wants new rules. You know, Mrs. Merkel wants to create fiscal and monetary union. A lot of other people want banking union. They want bailout. They want mutual transfers. The astonishing thing is that Germany, which swore to God and anything that was holy that would never enter a transfer union, has now entered a transfer union. What's more, it has already transferred a cool €1 trillion to the rest of Southern Europe through the back door of the ECB. The ECB has been printing money to keep the south of Europe afloat under the so-called target balance process in which they lend to the south, and in effect, implicitly, the north guarantees the loan. Without going into the technicalities, something like €1 trillion has already been lent in this way by the north to the south, and it's changing the whole time. That's in addition to the ESM and the EFSF, all these schemes for actual bailout. And so what has happened has been a massive rise in transfers, de facto, and the political project is clearly going ahead. Now, what we see is that the smaller countries that are in terrible trouble, Greece, Portugal, Spain and Ireland, are in a dreadful condition. But nevertheless, I mean, with something like 60% youth unemployment in Spain, I mean, extraordinary numbers. Extraordinary numbers. And yet, no one is saying they should leave the euro in those countries. This is the most astonishing thing. I think we have to take this on board in this country. There are polls the whole time, and they all show a majority for staying in the euro. And now I think these countries have probably come through the eye of the storm. There's slight signs of bottoming out, you know, in Greece even. So, and they've opted to stay. Now, people put it to me that the big question mark is, will France, Italy and Germany opt to stay in? There's a big debate in Germany. Should Germany pull out? And Hans Werner Sinn in Munich has argued that Germany should pull out, perhaps, you know, because it's getting beyond. But if you look in France and Italy, austerity is now very unpopular. We have the Beppe Grillo party, and so on. Now, the problem is, though, that what we're seeing is that in my view, they might be a split. Germany might leave. But the problem is, if it leaves, all that money it's lent to the south, it may never get it back. That's a cool third of German GDP. They might just lose, be written off. So that's a big binding agent, it seems to me, you see. The whole political project was all like in the art of war, you know, you fight a battle with your army having a river behind it. So they can't turn around and flee because they'll all drown. It's the same with this project. It's very hard to get out of it without drowning. And Germany is now finding itself unable to get out because it's already lent so much money. France and Italy, you know, will probably ask for slippage on austerity. Germany, with so much at stake, will probably give it, and that'll probably enough to stop this thing coming apart. Of course, it's a dreadful project. It's an awful disaster. I mean, it's a disaster for Europe. Europe's future looks bleak. But what we're seeing is that the European elite won't give it up. Then you say, well, what about democratic accountability? But in my experience, democracy on the continent doesn't work the same way it does here. What happens on the continent is people are unhappy about things. They go out on the streets and demonstrate for a week or so. And then they go back home and the politicians carry on as before, saying, we hear you. But they don't do anything about it because, you know, it doesn't suit them. That's not, and then of course, you know, it doesn't suit people to throw out the, look at what's happened in Italy. Beppe Grillo forms a party. The next thing we find out is all the old guys have come back and forming the government. It's made no difference at all. This is how politics works on the continent. I think it may be a wonderful way of doing business. I don't know. It wouldn't work here. Now, the thing is that there is a chance this thing would fall apart, but I don't think it has ever paid to underestimate the plans of the European elite. If you look at the creation of the European Union, it is an astonishing project. It's a stealth project of astonishing proportions. And it has succeeded. It has succeeded. It hasn't succeeded in this country totally yet, but you can see from the debate we're going to have here about how difficult it is to get out of a project. To have a referendum where you say you'll get out of something that you've been in for 25 years is very difficult to undertake, even in this country, which has a very strong democratic tradition and great skepticism towards politicians and a great willingness to overthrow existing sets of policies, as you saw in the Thatcher era. But I think that we shouldn't underestimate the difficulties of any reversal of what's going to go on the continent. So my prediction is that the euro is here to stay. It will lead to rules. There'll be Bodo. It'll be Bodo plus. Plus a lot. And it will be very unpopular in parts of southern Europe, but they won't leave because the alternative they think is even more frightening. A Greek friend of mine said that, you know, she was frightened that if they left the euro, the Turks might offer to help. Well, that's putting it a bit dramatically, but that sort of view is very prevalent in continental politics about the risks of this project coming unstuck because of the history of Europe and you know, the awful experiences that European countries had before all this. So my chapter is really about the implications of the UK. One of the things we fortunately got right was not to join this project. But I think when those of us who opposed this project, you know, were kind of arguing on economic grounds, I don't think we ever foresaw that not joining the euro would have such enormous implications for our relationship with Europe. And that's really what my chapter's about in the end. I'm saying, well, look, what's happening in Europe is going to lead to a completely different Europe. And it's no good saying the Eurozone, you know, will be doing things for the Eurozone and the single market and all the rest of Europe will remain unaffected. This is completely unrealistic. There would be spillover. The Eurozone will be in a majority on all the institutions of the EU, and they will argue that you know, everybody else in the EU should do things the same way, otherwise it's unfair competition. The implications for us, I think, are very, very serious. And Nigel Lawson, of course, wrote this article in the Times the other day where he spelled it out very, very clearly. And so I think what we're going to see is an EU developing in quite a protectionist way, very anti-finance. There's a big hatred of Anglo-Saxon financial institutions in Europe at the moment, in the continent. And you see that in the proposals for the financial transactions tax and the cap on bonuses. This is all part of the getting at the Anglo-Saxon financiers business. And, well, probably much worse that I can't predict in terms of the ideas of Anglo-Saxon competition are not really universally admired in continental circles. In Italy and France, this is considered to be a pretty bad idea, really. On the whole, you should have national champions and organized industry along proper lines that the French elite approve of and guarantee them permanent jobs running things. And so I don't think, you know, this concept, the concept of Europe that we're going to get is going to suit us at all. And so, well, as in fact Michael Portillo said this morning, either we don't have a referendum, we stay in which case we'll eventually join the euro and come into this set of rules, which will lead to interesting developments in this country. Or I think we get out, and that's really, I think, I would say that our getting out of the EU has now become inevitable. In fact, in many ways, we've already got out of the EU. What we have to do now is to actually make it legal.